Hey everybody, this is Russ from Metro Game Core. Today we're going to review the latest Anbernic handheld. It's the RG477V. And at face value, there's not a lot new going on with this handheld. It's got the same screen and processor we've been seeing all year, and the design is also similar to other Anbernic handhelds. And I think that's a pretty typical MO for Anbernic. They are known to just iterate on their previous models and make minor corrections and improvements over time. And many times it makes these handhelds feel a little bit boring, but sometimes it hits in just the right way. And I think that the RG477V is one of those latter examples, in the fact that this is probably the best vertical handheld they've ever made. It's got their 4.7-inch 960p resolution display with a 120Hz refresh rate, which makes it a wonderful match for 4x3 content all the way up to GameCube and PS2. And it's got the Dimensity 8300 chipset, which means you've got enough power to be able to play up through all of those systems with upscaled resolutions too. And so in this video, we're going to dive into all those little details, but long story short, if you're in the market for a premium and high-end Android-based handheld, and you want something with a 4x3 aspect ratio with a nice large screen, then this one is probably one of the best Anbernic devices I've seen in a while. So grab your favorite snack and drink, let's go ahead and dive in. Okay, let's start with the specs, and this is running the Dimensity 8300 CPU. That's the same top-tier chipset that they've been using throughout this year for their high-end models like the Anbernic RG557 and the RG477M. And as we've seen in those other videos, it's got a lot of raw performance power, which is somewhat hampered by its Mali GPU, just because it doesn't have the same type of compatibility that we can find with the Adreno GPUs found in Snapdragon chips. They are going to have two different SKUs for this, so there's an 8GB RAM model with 128 gigs of storage, and then also one with 12 gigs of RAM and 256 gigs of storage. As far as display, we've seen this in several other handhelds. It's 4.7 inches, 1280 by 960, 120 Hz, and LCD. And this is great in a couple different ways. 960p means it's going to be double of your typical 480p resolution outputs, and then also that 120Hz refresh rate is going to be great when it comes to input latency, as well as some additional screen effects. The battery is also a decent size. It's 5500 milliamp hours, and they say it also gets a 27-watt fast charge. And in my own testing, I found it to get somewhere around 25 watts on average, and so yes, I do think it is pretty good in terms of fast charge as well. But when all is said and done, it's a pretty large handheld too. It's 339 grams, or just under 12 ounces, making it one of the heavier devices that you can find within the size range. We've got some pretty good connectivity options here, Wi-Fi 6E and Bluetooth 5.3, and it is capable of video out, which we will test near the end of this video. It's also running Android 14, and another thing worth noting is that both of its two analog sticks are Hall magnetic sensors. Now, I got this review unit a little bit early, before they actually had launched their pre-order campaign, but I did get their launch information. It's going to go live in about 3 days, at 20th of December at 5 a.m. Eastern Time. And they also said that they have a bunch of stock already, so it should be able to start shipping immediately when the orders go live. As far as pricing, there's going to be an early bird period of the first 72 hours like they do with a lot of their other handhelds. It's going to start at $200 for the 8GB model, then $240 for the 12GB model. After those first 3 days, it's going to revert to retail pricing, $220 and $260 respectively. And as far as pricing goes, this is about in the middle of what we've seen with other Dimensity 8300 chipsets from this company. For example, the RG557, which only came in a 12GB model, is currently selling for $250, so this one's about $10 more expensive. On the other hand, the RG477M, which has a metal shell, is $10 more expensive than this one. So yeah, we're about in the middle right here. And I was expecting it to be a little bit more expensive just because of RAM price increases, so I'm happy to see that they are keeping it at a pretty standard level. Okay, let's take a look at the device itself, and of note, this was a review unit sent over by the company, but like with all my videos, all opinions are my own. They're not seeing this video ahead of time, and no money was exchanged in any way. We've got two different color options. There's a black model, and then also the retro gray, which is the one they sent me. Inside the box, there is really not a lot going on here. We've got the device itself, and then underneath, we've got a quick start guide, and then a USB-C charging cable. Okay, first impression, this has got an all-glass front to it, and I think this is the first vertical handheld where I've actually seen that. It's a little bit weird, you know, to have this like kind of sleek texture to it here on the front, but honestly, it's not half bad. It just kind of makes it all feel very flat on the front. I think if they had sent me the black model, I would have liked it less, just because it probably would have been much smudgier. Now, you can still see fingerprinting on the glass itself, and that may or may not annoy you, but I will say that over the past week or so of testing, it really hasn't bothered me that much, and I'm a guy who really gets bothered by smudges. But one thing I have noticed about this glass front is it makes the device feel quite a bit heftier. Like, this is a pretty heavy handheld. We'll test it here in a minute. My next impression is that I really like the design on the back of this handheld. It's got a flatter texture to it. It kind of feels like a return to the basics compared to some of their other high-end vertical handhelds, which had these rudimentary grips on them. Here's a look at their other previous designs, the RG475V and the 406V, and these essentially have the exact same shell to them, other than the upgraded chipset in this one here. And I've never been a big fan of this design here on the back. Yes, they have these ergonomic bumps on the back, and yes, it does make it more comfortable, but I feel like it's somewhat poorly designed and that it's just completely straight here, and it just doesn't feel like there's a lot of space to comfortably hold your hand. So A for effort in terms of just, trying to put grips on a vertical handheld, but I personally would rather have a flat back. And so I love the fact that the 477V did not retain that design and instead just went with a flat back. I feel like this gives me more options to put my hands across. It's a little bit counterintuitive. You would think that having grips would make it more comfortable, but I love the fact that I can just kind of put my hands anywhere on this design here. And I'm sure that we're going to see 3D printed grips available for this device in the coming months, but personally, I like this flat back. I like that it feels a lot more balanced in the hand. I also kind of like the squarish look of this one as well, compared to the more bulbous and kind of bloated look of the 405 and 406V models. And so overall, I really do like this design, even though I do think the glass front makes it a bit heavier. One other aspect of this handheld is that it is quite big compared to even larger vertical handhelds. So here's a smattering of some of the others and how they compare in terms of size. And it is quite a bit bigger than some of these other models, and I also think it probably has the best screen to body ratio. It's almost like a 50-50 split, and I think it looks really nicely balanced. It's kind of crazy to think that this has got a 4.7-inch 4x3 display compared to others that are around 4 inches for a similar size. It is missing some features compared to the others, like an OLED panel, but I do really love this high resolution display and a 120 Hz refresh rate. So all in all, when compared to the others, I think it's a nice looking handheld with an excellent screen to body ratio. It is quite large, but it's still, only about the size of the screen of the Steam Deck OLED. So, you can take that for what it's worth. Now at 339 grams, this is one of the heavier vertical handhelds I've ever seen. If you look at something like the Retroid Pocket Classic, it's about a third of the overall weight. And as we start inching up in the other vertical handhelds, yes, none of them really come close to that 339. The Game Boy DMG is the closest with a cartridge and batteries inside of it, but still, this is a chunky handheld and still lighter than the RG477V. It's about 10% heavier than the RG476H, the other glass front handheld that Anbernic released this year. And there are handhelds that are heavier than it. For example, the RG557, same chipset here, is a little bit heavier, but it has a 5.5-inch screen. The RG477M is also a little bit heavier, but this one has that aluminum shell. When it comes down to it, the RG477V is definitely on the heavier side in terms of handhelds, but it's not the heaviest thing out there. For example, it's lighter than the Thor because this one has 2 screens, and it's lighter than the RG Slide, which remains the heaviest compact handheld I've ever used. When you put it all together, I consider the RG477V to be a pretty portable handheld, but not something that I would necessarily put in my pocket. I feel like it's a better couch handheld more than anything. Yes, if you have larger pockets, you might be able to squeeze it in, but it's not necessarily something that I would want to take around. Instead, I've just been enjoying it as a vertical couch handheld, and that's probably where it shines the most. This form factor does feel a little bit more cramped compared to a horizontal handheld, but all the same, it is very nostalgic because of that Game Boy shape. And so overall, I do like this design. We've got a nice big display and some roomy controls and a lot of space on the back to be able to put our hands as well. And so yes, I think that overall, this is probably one of the more comfortable vertical handhelds that Anbernic has made. It reminds me of the RG40XXV, which up until today was probably my favorite vertical handheld from Anbernic. It's a lot cheaper and it has a much weaker processor, but I love this overall design. It's very comfortable. We've got a lot of space here on the back. It's also flat and it has a 4-inch display to it. And so this one is always been an excellent vertical handheld, and it feels like the 477V is kind of the successor in every single way. This one's got 2 analog sticks, a bigger and better screen, a better processor to it, but still has that same design ethos to it. And so, yeah, I'm really enjoying the overall design of this one. Let's talk about the controls, and some of this is actually very familiar and some of it is a little bit new. Let's start with the D-pad. So this one does not have any sort of markings on the front of it, and that's kind of rare. Most Anbernic devices have like the little triangles on each end and they have like a grippy texture to them, but this one is not. It's just kind of a flat design. It reminds me a bit of the Analog Pocket. And so I'm not sure what prompted this design here. I'm used to this kind of Super Nintendo design, but overall this one looks a little bit more sleek and premium by comparison. As far as functionality, it's a classic Anbernic feeling. We've got that rubber membrane D-pad, so it's nice and bouncy. It's also got good pivot. And even though it does have a glass front here, this circle right here is not glass. So there is plastic underneath, so you're not pressing down directly on glass. So I think it feels pretty good. And as far as real-world use, it works absolutely fine. So in the Contra test, I like to press down the D-pad and lightly rock it left and right, and the character does not really move. Now, if I try to push it even further on one side or the other, I can make the character move, and that's ideal with this particular test. What this says to me is that we're not going to get a lot of accidental diagonals when playing very precise games like Contra or Tetris and so on. So yes, what I found over the past week of testing, this is a very good D-pad in that regard. Along those same lines, I also like to test it with Street Fighter 3 Third Strike. So here I'm trying to test how easy it is to hit the diagonals when I want to. And to me, this is about on par with what I would expect. It takes a little bit of effort to really pull off the Hadoukens and Shoryukens, but once I adapted to it after a couple rounds, I had no problem whatsoever. And so again, from a functionality standpoint, yes, this D-pad works really well with a variety of different games. Next, let's talk about these analog sticks. So these are Hall sensor sticks, very similar to others that we've seen from Anbernic over the past year or so. And one nice thing is that they don't stick out too much from the shell compared to some of the other devices they've released. That was my main complaint about the 406V. This one had sticks that were quite prominent, and when you combine that with the ergonomic bumps on the back, it just was a pretty thick handheld for being a vertical, and we don't really have those issues with this new one. Instead, we've got something a bit more sleek. These sticks will still stick out more than the other stuff, but it's not so bad. You can also pull out these caps and then replace them with something else. If you want something bigger or smaller, there are plenty of other options that will fit this same post. As far as inputs go, we've got a nice wide range of motion. The sticks aren't pressing against the shell in any way, so it feels pretty good to use. And also testing it with a gamepad tester app, I'm not detecting any sort of cardinal snapping. If anything, it just wants to snap back to the center when you let go of it, which is not necessarily a bad thing. The dead zones on this are a little bit large. You can see that white square right there in the center. So that's really my only complaint, is that it's not a perfect zero dead zone, but overall it does feel pretty smooth. And as far as playing an actual game like Mario 64, it feels very smooth. So I've got no complaints about the analog stick motion here. I'm able to easily make Mario walk or run depending on how hard I press the stick. And so no complaints for me when it comes to these sticks overall. And even though it looks a little bit weird to have them closer to the center, this is probably the most comfortable place they could have put them, where I can naturally just move my thumb over from the D-pad to the analog stick and so on. And so I really like this overall design. It's not necessarily something I would enjoy playing with a twin stick shooter just because of the distance between the sticks and the triggers, but overall this is just one genre of games that I would probably not want to play on a vertical anyway. So your mileage will definitely vary depending on the type of game that you're playing. If you're playing with just a single analog stick, I find it to be very comfortable, but with a two analog stick setup like this, I would rather play on something else. It's worth noting these analog sticks do have RGB lights to them, so you can turn them on, you can change their colors and all that stuff. I personally just leave them off, but if you wanted to adjust them and customize them, you can totally do that within the Android settings. Okay, let's talk about the face buttons, and these are the same typical Anbernic experience. They have rubber membrane to them, very kind of old and classic feeling, and I feel like they perfected these many years ago, and they're continuing that trend, so no issues with the face buttons either. And then finally, we've got our three menu buttons. We've got select and start, and then a back and home button here for Android, and that's really about it. Each of these buttons are micro switches, so they're a little bit clicky, but not too bad. Now, one thing that's new with this device is that the select and start buttons are actually LED lights, so we can actually turn them on, and you can see it says select and start like that. I honestly just turned them off as soon as I got the device, but if that's something you want to see, then totally go for it. It kind of looks like an old school arcade or something like that, but personally, I like it with the lights off. Okay, on the right side, we've got our power and sleep button as well as our volume up and down. Up top, we have our USB-C port, so this can work for charging as well as video out. And we have an LED indicator right here for when you're charging, it'll turn orange and then green when it's done. We also have our fan exhaust right here because we have our fan intake here on the back. On the left side, we've got a micro SD card flap. This is hard plastic. You can see I've got a 512 gigabyte card inside, no problems with that. And I like the fact that it actually goes flush when you close it, unlike some other Anbernic devices. We've got a single button right here, which will open up their RG launcher, and you can also program this to open up other apps if you would like to. On the bottom, we've got a 3.5mm headphone jack, and then 2 stereo speakers. We'll test those in a moment. And then on the back, we've got our fan intake as well as the just grip itself, and then our shoulder and trigger buttons. You can see it's got a bit of an angle to it, which allows me to rest my index finger on it comfortably, and it's not too thick either, so it's just enough of a shelf to be able to rest my fingers. The inputs are digital and clicky, so you're not going to have an analog input here, unfortunately, for stuff like GameCube, but I do like the fact that they are nice and quiet as well. They have dampened down the overall microswitch click. They're easy to press down on, so I've got no complaints about these other than the fact that they are not analog. So I think in terms of controls and ergonomics, I don't have a lot of complaints about the RG477V, other than the fact that you may not like that vertical form factor because it does make your hands a little bit cramped. But otherwise, I think it's comfortable, it's big, it's a bit heavy, but not too heavy. And so in general, I've just really enjoyed this overall design. Okay, next we'll talk about the screen, and there's nothing new here. We've seen it in 3 or 4 different Anbernic devices, and I'm really happy to see it here as well. When we get to the game testing, I'll talk about each of the different systems and how they look, but in general, everything looks great. 4x3, 3x2, even 10x9 systems all look very nice on this larger display. As far as brightness, I think it does get sufficiently bright. It's not the brightest screen in the world. I think that when you're in direct sunlight, it's a little bit harder to see under the cloud cover, but if you're going to be in the shade, I think it's perfectly suitable to be able to play outdoors as well. For my part, I've only been playing it at about 30% brightness, as you can see right here, so it does get much brighter than I need in an indoor environment, which I think is a good thing. It also gets quite dim. This is at 0% brightness right here, and you can see that it's kind of hard to see the screen at all, which is a good thing. So I think you will be able to play this in very dark conditions too. One of my favorite things about this screen is it's got a 120 Hz refresh rate. That allows us to use tools like black frame insertion or CRT beam simulator to give us increased motion clarity. I made a whole video about it. I'll leave it linked down below, but that's one of my favorite aspects of this. If you combine it with an actual CRT shader, it just looks very old school and awesome. It kind of feels like playing on an old school CRT television, but with all the modern perks of an LCD display. Okay, next we're going to test the audio here. They are down-firing speakers, but I think that they don't sound half bad. And so yes, overall, I think the speakers are clear, they get nice and loud, and I'm able to hear a difference between the low, the mids, and the highs. My only complaint would be that the speakers are kind of close together, so it's hard to hear a stereo differentiation between the two, but otherwise I think it's pretty good audio for what we're getting here. Okay, let's talk about performance and benchmarks. It was a wild roller coaster ride getting here, but thankfully things are mostly resolved. I first noticed something was up when I tried the 3D Mark Wildlife Extreme stress test. This is a standard test that I often use for a lot of these handhelds to show GPU performance, but then also how it's going to run over a 20-minute period, because it just loops this really intensive test 20 different times, 1 minute each. And the scores here were crazy. I got 3182 here with the best loop score. That's the first minute, which is kind of expected with this chipset, but then it dropped down to 789 after just a couple minutes, and that's a 24.8% stability, absolutely the lowest I've ever seen in any other handheld. And you can see it just plain as day that it started out really fast and then dropped down and then dropped down even more, and so by loop 3 it was 789. Now it slowly recovered after that and it stabilized around 1400 after that, but still that's not very good considering that we got over 3000 in that first minute. And you can watch the performance tank in real time. For example, here I'm running the test, and you can see that the CPU temperature gets up to 105 degrees Celsius. And once it hits that, it starts to thermal throttle, and the performance dips significantly after that. And so this is the problem that I was running into when using the high performance mode. It would get so hot, over 105 degrees Celsius, that the performance would absolutely tank to the point where the performance is almost like a previous generation handheld. And as soon as I saw this, I reported it to the company to say, hey, is this happening to everybody or is it just my device? What is going on here? Either the cooling is really bad or something is up with the software. And within a few days, they released an OTA update, which included new performance profiles, auto mode, performance mode, and high performance mode. So I ran the test again, but this time in the performance mode, so the middle tier, and you can see that the scores here are excellent. So I got 2980 as my best loop score, and then 2827. So almost the exact same across the entire 20 minutes, a 95% stability rate, much better. And you can see that yes, there's a bit of a dip as you go across, but it's not as bad as it was previously. And so this seems like a much more stable experience. In fact, this makes the performance a lot more stable than their other devices with the same chipset. The RG477M had a stability of about 60% here, and it dropped down to 1865. So overall, yes, now the 477V is doing better. The raw performance is actually pretty close to the iNeo Pocket DMG. You can see that 3771 the best loop score, but the lowest loop score is 2976, which is not that far off from the Anbernic. And of course, it's miles better than the previous generation vertical flagship from Anbernic. This one is the 406V, and the best loop score was 568. So this one is about a fourth of the performance power of the other model. Among the Anbernic devices with this Dimensity chipset, the RG557 does the best job. It's got a 3212 to 3187, so 99% stability here. So whatever cooling is within the RG557 is doing a better job than the 477V. Now, even though the OTA update fixed the performance mode here and it does a much better job, I was surprised to find that the high performance mode does a lousy job. In fact, it's much worse than the performance mode. I did the exact same test with the high performance mode, and the overall scores were much worse. The best loop was 1706 and the lowest loop was 713. So that's only a 41.8% stability. So what this says to me is maybe they got the performance modes mixed up, and that the performance mode here is supposed to be the high performance mode, and maybe they just mislabeled them. But either way, I've been testing everything with the performance mode, and that's worked out pretty well. The new performance profile also reduces the overall thermals. The absolute hottest that I could get it was about 88 degrees Celsius when playing a GameHub game and pushing it as hard as I could. So in general, I don't think we're going to see issues with actual thermal throttling going forward. It's also worth noting that community developer Gamma already has his device in hand as well, and he's already ported over his operating system too, and he's getting very excellent results as well. So even if Anbernic is not able to completely streamline the process, we are going to have third-party options here in the future. It's also worth noting that externally, the thermals do a pretty good job as well. Even when pushing it as hard as I could when running a benchmark, the hottest I got it on the back was around 32 degrees Celsius, which is going to be a little bit less than skin temperature. So honestly, this is going to be fine. The hottest spot that I could find was near the bottom of the front display, and this still only got to around 34 degrees Celsius, still less than skin temperature. So overall, it's a cool running device. But it's also worth noting I'm not a huge fan of the audio profile of this fan as well. It just kind of feels cheap and a bit loud. And so it is annoying, but not the end of the world. One of the nice things about a vertical is that the fan is right here on the back. And so even as it's blowing and it can get quite loud, you personally aren't going to hear it that much. Maybe someone else in the room is going to hear it more loudly than you will, especially when you're playing it like this. You've got the speakers going or you're wearing headphones. So it's not that big of a deal, but something worth noting. Now let's move on to performance, and we'll run through each of the systems and talk about the overall experience with the RG477V. When it comes to the old school systems, basically anything running through RetroArch, I'm using a special shader called the CRT Beam Simulator. This is the thing I talked about earlier where I said I had my own video about it. I'll leave a link down below, but you basically want to set this up in RetroArch with the video synchronization settings. You want to turn on shader subframes to 2. From there, once you start up a game, you want to go into shaders and then subframe BFI, and then within there's the CRT Beam Simulator. Again, I've got that whole video link down below, but this is what I have turned on for all of my old school games. This will give your games a nice amount of motion clarity, which just feels a bit more like a CRT television. And on top of that, you can add other shaders. For example, with Game Boy and Game Boy Color, I add on one called the LCD 3X Grid Shader, so it looks a bit like an old school display. And even though these systems don't line up perfectly in terms of aspect ratio, it's still nice and big. We're looking at 4.2 inches of screen real estate. It's a similar story with Game Boy Advance. This one will have black bars at the top and bottom because the original aspect ratio of 3:2 was a bit wider than the 4:3 we have on this display, but still I think it looks very good, and you have 4.5 inches of overall real estate. But of course, the systems that really shine on this particular display are going to be those that run natively at a 4:3 aspect ratio. That's going to be most to your home console systems all the way up through the 3D era. And for all these home console systems, I used a CRT effect. I'm using the CRT GameHub Deluxe shader. This is a relatively heavyweight shader, but the chipset on this device can handle it no problem, in addition to that CRT beam simulator. And so I ended up setting this as a global profile in RetroArch. So every game that I started up would have this effect already turned on. And then of course, for the other systems like Game Boy and Game Boy Advance, I just turned them onto LCD3X shader and then did a core override. And this is one of those experiences that you have to see in real life to really appreciate. The CRT effect here makes everything look a lot nicer and more in-depth, and it has that nice fuzziness that makes it just look like the game originally was supposed to look. And then when you combine that with that CRT beam simulator, it feels like the sprites are just jumping out of the display and they feel super crisp. And so yes, this is one of my favorite ways to play retro games on a vertical handheld. And moving up to the 3D era, I did the exact same thing here, but then I also upscaled these games to a 960p resolution to match the exact resolution of this display. Most of these systems, like for example Dreamcast, ran at a 480p resolution, so I'm just playing it at a 2x resolution upscale, and these games look great. We've also got enough power to be able to run the CRT Beam Simulator and GameHub Deluxe shaders while still playing these games at full speed with minimal flickering. The only system that gave me problems with this particular setup was Sega Saturn, just because this one is much more demanding with the Beetle Saturn core, and so I was getting flickering with some of these games. This is mostly because the device is having a hard time maintaining a perfect 120Hz refresh rate, and so that's why we see the flickering from time to time. And the easy fix for this is just to turn off that CRT Beam Simulator shader. It's not going to give you the best motion clarity, but you can still have the nice CRT effect, and these games are going to play at full speed, no problem. And so the only exception when playing RetroArch was Sega Saturn with the Beetle Saturn core. This one I did not play with the CRT Beam Simulator shader just because of the flickering, but I was still able to use a heavy-duty CRT shader and play these games at full speed. Now moving on to PSP, these games will play absolutely fine at a 3x resolution upscale, which will cap out the amount of pixels we have on this display. Because it's a 16:9 aspect ratio system, you are going to get black bars at the top and bottom, but it's not too bad, and you're still going to get 4.3 inches of overall screen real estate. So I would say the PSP is still playable on this display. I'd much rather play it on something that's natively 16:9, but this will still get the job done. But I think in terms of high-end systems that work the best with this particular handheld and this display, it really has to be GameCube and PS2, because these are such a nice natural fit. And playing these games at a 2x resolution is a perfect fit. These games are going to look awesome, they're going to fit across the entire display, and they're also going to fill out the overall resolution. So this is an ideal way to play GameCube if you ask me. However, this is also where you can start to see the cracks in the Mali GPU drivers that we have on this device. It becomes really apparent when trying to play certain GameCube games with the Vulkan backend. For example, here with F-Zero GX, you can see that the sky is very bright. It's almost like playing in the daytime, and this is not how it looked on the original console. If we switch over to OpenGL, you can see that the sky is much darker, and this is a more representative version of this actual game. And so this is what I would recommend playing, and I'm still playing it at a 2x resolution upscale, and it's playing no problem. In fact, if we look at the max number here in the top stats, you can see it's around 225%. So even when playing this game at a 2x resolution upscale, we still have plenty of headroom to be able to play this even further. So the only real hiccup when it comes to playing GameCube is that there will be some GPU driver issues. Here with Mario Golf, you can see that Mario is not appearing at all when using the Vulkan backend. Switching over to OpenGL is going to make it a more accurate experience at the expense of requiring more processing power. But thankfully, yes, this will still work absolutely fine. Some games are not perfect even when switching it over to OpenGL. For example, with Mario Tennis here, it will show the overall score as being a much darker text than I remember, and so this looks to be a GPU driver issue. But thankfully, the vast majority of the games on Dolphin are going to be a plug-and-play experience. Just set this to a 2x resolution upscale, and then, toggle between Vulkan and OpenGL depending on the game, and you'll be good after that. So I am comfortable in saying this is a GameCube-friendly handheld. You'll be able to play most of these games at an upscaled resolution. You're going to have the same experience with Nintendo Wii, but just bear in mind that you have to turn all these to a 4:3 aspect ratio, and some Wii games will only force 16:9, so it's going to have black bars at the top and bottom, but the performance will be largely the same as it was on GameCube. Now moving on to PS2, it's a very similar experience. I played all these games at a 2.25x resolution upscale. That's a little bit more pixels than you can see on this display, but I did find it to be a little bit sharper than just a straight 2x resolution. And so all the games that I tested here played absolutely fine at a 2.25x resolution upscale, even some harder to play games like Gran Turismo 4 and Jak 3. Yes, I was finding this to be an excellent experience. It's not really surprising considering that the Dimensity 8300 has been in a couple other Anbernic devices, and these results are identical to those other devices as well. So when it comes down to it, if you're looking for a PS2 capable handheld, something that will play in a native 4:3 aspect ratio where you can upscale it to a higher resolution, then this is going to be an excellent match. Even games like Sly Cooper played really well with minimal slowdowns, and so I would say this is going to be a playable experience here, even at that 2.25x resolution upscale. The only one I had to downgrade to get a good gameplay experience was Champions of Norrath. I had to drop this to a 2x resolution upscale, and it still looked very good and much better than the native resolution. And so, yeah, I think that in general, this is going to be a good PS2 handheld. The only game that gave me actual trouble was God of War 2, and I'm not really sure what's going on here. God of War 1 plays absolutely fine, and games that are harder to run than this game played better too. I think it just really has to do something with the Mali GPU in this particular game. This is running the latest version of Nether SX2 Classic. I know there are other versions of this app floating around that might give you better performance, but out of the box, yes, this one does struggle a little bit, but in the vast majority of the games that I tested, there were no problems whatsoever. So it may not be a perfect PS2 experience for every single game that's available in their catalog, but I think the vast majority are going to be absolutely fine. Okay, moving on from there, I also tested a little bit of Nintendo Switch emulation. Now, I don't think this is a device you should be buying to play Nintendo Switch on for various reasons. To start, you're playing a 16:9 console on a 4:3 display, which means you'll have those black bars at the top and bottom, and 4.3 inches of screen real estate, which on Nintendo Switch does feel a little bit cramped just because the text can get a little bit small. So instead, I would say that Nintendo Switch is a system that you might be able to play in a pinch on this particular handheld, but there are much better ways to enjoy it. Also bear in mind that the Mali GPU does not really work super well with this particular emulator. It's gotten better over the past several months, but we're still seeing a lot of stutters in games like Cuphead and Hades, to the point where, again, I would rather play this on a different device with a Snapdragon chipset, and probably something that preferably had a 16:9 aspect ratio. So if anything, I would say that until we get third-party driver support with a Mali GPU, we're going to be stuck with just this being a bonus console, and that yes, you might be able to play some Switch games, but don't expect to play all of them. And there are going to be some games that will struggle to play at full speed. Super Mario 3D World and Bowser's Fury does have quite a few hiccups to the point where I wouldn't really enjoy playing this even in handheld mode. Same thing with Mario Odyssey. This one only averages about 45 frames per second, and you can definitely feel that slowdown. So this is not an ideal way to play this game. There are going to be several other games that play just fine on other similar handhelds that have Snapdragon processors that just aren't going to work here. For example, Donkey Kong Country, Tropical Freeze, and then same thing with Yoshi's Crafted World. This one only plays at about 3 frames per second, and you can't even see the image on the screen anyway. Other games like Sonic Superstars just straight up crash once you start the game. And so unfortunately, yes, it's going to be hit or miss when it comes to playing this particular system on this handheld. I also tested out PC games via GameHub on this handheld. Now, this is also at a disadvantage because of those Mali GPU drivers. Many of these GameHub style apps are focused mostly on Snapdragon chipsets, but I was surprised to see that most games played pretty well. I mostly stuck with lightweight games and those that have really good compatibility across other handhelds, and I was surprised to find that yes, most of these booted up just fine. It is worth noting that I'm testing the 12GB RAM model, and RAM is very important when playing apps like GameHub because this will compensate for the lack of GPU. So I do think that if you plan on playing lightweight PC games, the 12GB option might be worth that increased price, especially because it comes with 256GB of internal storage, which is also important when installing these PC games. To give you an idea in terms of performance, I was able to play Fallout 3 here. Not a stable 60 frames per second, but it still was at least playable to me, hovering around 30 and 40 frames per second when in combat. But other games like Megabonk had a really hard time playing on here, averaging about 20 to 25 frames per second, so I would not consider this to be very playable. And also in my brief testing, there were some games that would not launch at all. For example, Hades 2, which usually runs just fine on just about every handheld, did not even boot on this Mali GPU. Now, I usually focus on emulation and PC games, but I did test out a couple Android games too, and it was nice to see that some of these were working well, like Stardew Valley and Wuthering Waves. It's great that many of these games will scale to a 4:3 aspect ratio as well, so you're not losing any screen real estate, and you're not having to deal with black bars at the top and bottom, so that's always nice to see. But I also ran into some typical hiccups that I will find with Anbernic software. For example, Diablo Immortal does not pick up on the controls at all, so this game is unplayable unless you plan on using the touchscreen for your controls. And this has been a widespread issue with a lot of their Anbernic Android-based devices where they just aren't quite up to par with some of the other builds that we've seen with other companies like Retroid and AYN, and even Neo has improved theirs to the point where it has eclipsed Anbernic as well. And then finally, I also did some game streaming. I started with local streaming with a computer here at the studio using Apollo and Artemis, and my overall decoding time was only 6 milliseconds, which is pretty good. So I would say this is easily something that you could use for local streaming. I also tested out cloud streaming with NVIDIA GeForce Now and Xbox Game Pass, mostly to test out whether or not the controls would work, because I ran into issues with those Android games, but thankfully the controls will actually work in these apps. So yes, you will be able to do cloud streaming with most of the popular apps as well. Now next, before we talk about battery and start wrapping up, I also did test out the video out capability of the RG477V. Here I'm using a cheap Ugreen dock to supply power to the handheld and then video out to my monitor, and yeah, it worked out pretty well. The only issue I ran into is that I was not able to change the aspect ratio of the device that I was pushing the video to, and so it stayed at a 4:3 aspect ratio, and there's no toggle within the software. And this will work out fine when you're playing, 4:3 content, but you might want to use widescreen hacks or play something like PSP, and unfortunately this is going to be a forced 4:3 unless they fix it in the software. But it is nice to see that video out is working and you can charge the device at the same time. Okay, now let's talk about battery life. I did 4 different main tests here. It is worth noting I played everything at 50% brightness and volume and with the 120 Hz refresh rate turned on. I put the device to sleep overnight to test that battery as well. I dropped 2% overnight, which is a pretty good test right there to show that yes, you can use this in sleep mode most of the time. Let's start on the right with our best case scenario. So this is Yoshi's Island with RetroArch, and I am pushing it pretty hard. I'm using the CRT Beam Simulator shader as well as the CRT Geom Deluxe, and this is running in auto mode. I got 5 hours and 16 minutes of overall gameplay. Now, if I turned off those shaders and I reduced it down to a 60 Hz refresh rate, I'm sure we would get probably double the battery life. Here, I would expect something like 10 hours, but I did want to show the worst case scenario here where you're playing Super Nintendo at its max potential. You're still going to get over 5 hours of battery life. Moving over to something more demanding, here's Dragon Quest VIII on PS2, running at a 2.25x resolution, again with the auto mode and auto fan turned on, and I got 4.5 hours of battery life. That's pretty darn great, and that's about what I was seeing with both GameCube and PS2. Next, I wanted to push the device as hard as I could. I started with just running the 3D Mark benchmark, and this is running in that performance mode. I got an average of 3 hours and 8 minutes of overall battery life, which honestly is still pretty good when maxing it out with a GPU benchmark. The only way that I could get worse battery life was by playing GameHub and trying to push it as far as I could. So this is Ball X Pit. I'm running it at the native 960p resolution here, and I'm running it in performance mode with the sport fan turned on the entire time. And I got a little bit under 3 hours of battery life. So you can see here that even in a worst case scenario, you can still get close to 3 hours of battery life, which I think is pretty great. And of course, when playing lightweight stuff, you will get much longer game time. Okay, so that's it for testing. Let's wrap up and talk about what I like and what I don't like about the Anbernic RG477V. As always, we'll start with what I like. Number one, I think this is very comfortable as far as vertical handhelds go. I love the fact that they remove those bumps on the back. It just feels a lot more flat and ergonomic and balanced. I also think the placement of the controls are excellent, and they're about the best that they can be with this particular form factor. I also love that we've got a 4.7-inch display in a vertical handheld. The thing is kind of big. It's like holding a ham sandwich, but it's really nice to be able to see everything that's happening on this display. And so I think a lot of people who enjoy vertical handhelds are going to enjoy this one. The controls are also very good. Good D-pad, the analog sticks work very well. Overall, it's just a very comfortable and ergonomic experience. I also love that this is just a no-frills Anbernic handheld. They didn't add anything flashy other than that glass screen on the front, and it just feels like it's a back-to-basics device. And honestly, I think that this is where Anbernic shines the the most, where they just kind of feed on the iterations that they've done over the years and just try to get closer and closer to perfection, and I think they got a little bit closer here. But of course, it's not perfect, and so there are some things worth nitpicking. The number one thing for me are these thermal issues. Now, they fixed it with their recent OTA update, but it's not quite fixed. For example, if you go in the high performance mode, the performance absolutely tanks. So I think that there is another update that's due, but it is nice to see that it's at least working right now. Another thing I don't like is that the fan does get quite loud, especially when putting it in sports mode, which is going to be required for playing things like PC games and some high-end systems like Nintendo Switch and even some harder to run PS2 games. It's also worth noting that the Android software that we have on this device is kind of at a B tier. It feels like other companies have been getting better and better, and Anbernic is just kind of staying the same. The software is generally functional, but you should also be able to do some very basic things like plugging this into a monitor and having it show up as 16:9. It's been several years that other companies have been able to do that, but for some reason Anbernic has not been able to. And then finally, it's also worth noting this is not a cheap handheld. It starts at $200 early bird and goes all the way up to $260 before shipping. And so make no mistake about it, this is a pricey handheld, but I think in relation to the other devices they've released, I would not consider it to be overpriced, at least not by a lot. When it comes down to it, whether or not I recommend the Anbernic RG477V is largely going to depend on you. Do you want something with a big screen, a powerful processor, and a vertical form factor? Because right now, this is the only device that provides all three, and I think it does an excellent job at that. It's just going to come at a pretty high price of about $260 in the worst case scenario before shipping. For me personally, when it comes to a Game Boy form factor device, I think of it like a Game Boy, and I want to play Game Boy style games, more retro stuff. And so personally, I think that something like the Anbernic RG40XX at around $60 or the Retroid Pocket Classic at around $130, these are better fits for my own play style. But if you're looking for something that kind of does it all, but with that vertical form factor, then I think the RG477V can't be beat. This one is going to play all that retro stuff really well, to the point where you can use additional heavy-duty shaders on it, and you also have that big nice screen and analog sticks to be able to play additional systems that you wouldn't on the Retroid Pocket Classic. So it really will come down to you and what you want out of your handheld. If you're looking for a vertical that does it all, I would say that the Anbernic is a really great fit in that regard. This combination of ergonomics and controls and processor and screen are a really excellent match when you put them all together, but it is going to cost you to get something like this. So in the end, I would say that if you watched this video and you liked everything that you saw about the RG477V, you're probably going to enjoy this handheld as well. But I also think that a vertical handheld like this is not going to be a perfect match for everybody, and if you're just now jumping into this handheld stuff, then this may not be the best match for you. I just released a video talking about my favorite handhelds of 2025. I'll also leave that link down below if you want to explore a little bit further. When it comes down to it, I think the RG477V is an excellent handheld, one of the best that Anbernic has made, but at this price point, it is also worth exploring your other options to make sure it's the perfect match for you. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. As always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.